Hi folks, welcome to another edition of Government Matters here on Focus Springfield. My name is Mike Dobbs, I'm your host, and today we have State Senator Jake Oliveira with us. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be back, Mike.
Okay, I prepared. I got some questions here for you. First of all, what have been, the legislature has been on its summer break. I know that you're always working, but still. And I'm wondering what people are telling you. What are their concerns, especially going into this fall election? Are there issues that keep coming up when they, grab you when you're in your driveway or at the grocery store? What are folks talking to you about?
So first of all, it's nice to have a little reprieve from going into the city, into Boston on a daily basis, but we are still continuing to pass legislation that we worked hard on in the previous session. In fact, this week we actually passed a major matching bill to allow us to use our rainy day fund, which is one of the healthiest in the country at $8 billion. It was below $2 billion going into the pandemic, and now it's at $8 billion. So what we're utilizing in the bill that was sent to the governor's desk will actually take the interest rate from that $8 billion that we're getting from it and using it for federal matching funds. So the federal government, when they pass major pieces of legislation, they usually require matching funds from the state government. And so with the Deficit Reduction Act that Congress passed and President Biden signed into law, with the infrastructure bill that could go to things like improving our rail lines and our commuter lines here in Massachusetts, and the CHIPS and Science Act, we're going to leverage some of those interest dollars so we don't have to take it off of the operating budget in order to access those federal funds. So just this week, that actually passed and has been sent to Governor Healey's desk. But we do get an opportunity over the last several weeks to be in our districts, to interact with our constituents, which we do even when we are in session, holding regular office hours in each of the 12 communities. And we're hearing a lot of the kitchen table issues that people are talking about. If you look at your electric rates and the rates that are going up right now, and talking about those increases I'm hearing from constituents. Just this morning, when I was having breakfast at a diner, I heard from someone there who's looking at affordable housing and needs some help filling out those application forms. So housing continues to be an issue that we hear people talking about, and hopefully we can talk about the housing bond bill that we passed this session, but also talking about things like making sure that children have access to high-quality early childhood education. I think that's front and center on people's minds. And then the continuing thing that we've seen since the pandemic is the focus on mental health rates and ensuring that people have the proper well-being for themselves, for their family members, for their loved ones, for their long-term care and stability. Those are things that we're hearing people talk about quite often. But I definitely say housing, mental health, and looking at things, ensuring that we keep costs down for the utilities that people rely on.
In terms of the utility prices, I mean, how much I know that the state government does have a role in that, but is it strong enough a role that you could actually reverse price increases? Because that doesn't happen too often.
So the Department of Public Utilities every 6 months or so negotiates the rates with the electric companies that we all pay. And so if you look at your bill, you'll see the delivery charge has gone up significantly when you look at the delivery charge of things. And so we've been collecting from constituents who share their bills with us, sending them to the Department of Public Utilities and saying to them, listen, we want to give you the tools necessary in order to provide and prevent these rate increases that are passed on to the consumers later on. But it's also about how we're transitioning our fuel sources here in Massachusetts as well. We're really trying to invest in things like offshore wind, looking at Canadian hydroelectric in order to get that supply necessary to keep those rates down for consumers. Myself, my heat is all electric in my complex, so I see those spiking rates, particularly as we go into the colder months where you're seeing those rate increases. But we can also help people that rely on subsidies get those subsidies that are necessary. And I'm proud to say over the last few sessions, the legislature and the governor has invested significantly in fuel assistance, particularly for our seniors and veterans. And so if you are eligible for those types of subsidies, we'd be happy to work with you if you live in our district, work with you to ensure that you're getting that subsidy so you can heat your home, so you can provide the electricity that's necessary. So there are steps that we are taking at the state level, not just to try to keep those rates from rising, but also providing the subsidies to those vulnerable populations that rely on it and need the break.
Now, you just mentioned about legislation that you folks recently passed and brought it up to Governor Healy's desk. Now, did you go back into special session?
We did not go back into special session
because we have these bills that everyone's talking about, like economic
Yep.
bills. So I just was wondering about where that status is.
So there are three major pending bills that have not emerged out of conference committee. So the legislature, both the House and the Senate, have passed different versions. First off, of an economic development bill that is so heavily focused on regional equity for Western Massachusetts. In particular, on the Senate side, includes $40 million right for quantum innovation and development directed towards the Pioneer Valley. And so quantum is the transfer of information through light. There is extensive research being done at our colleges and universities, but also that there's a manufacturing component of it as well that could be a benefit for this area. The economic development bill on the Senate side, the Senate version, includes $40 million for that development right here in the Pioneer Valley. The other big area in the economic development bill is $30 million for food science and development, partnering with the University of Massachusetts. And it's not going to be just centered at the University of Massachusetts campus. Obviously, University of Massachusetts Amherst has a campus here in Springfield, but they also have research facilities throughout the Pioneer Valley. And those dollars, looking at food research and development, which is something that's used worldwide now, can be a major boom for this area. And both of those proposals are within the Senate version of the economic development bill. The chair of that committee, Barry Feingold, who's from the Merrimack Valley, has signaled that we might be going into special session over the next couple of weeks to get that bill over the finish line. So we are waiting for the conference committee to come out with that report. So I'm hoping that we can get that done before the end of session. But there are two other major bills that I want to highlight that are in conference right now. One bill that the Senate has passed for 4 sessions in a row called the PACT Act, which is designed to provide affordable prescription drugs for populations that need it. It caps things like insulin for diabetes, heart medications, and things that people rely on a daily basis in order to keep themselves alive. We cap the pricing on those things that are essential for folks at $25 for name brand drugs and $0 for a monthly supply for generic drugs. That's included within the PACT Act. There's two
Now,
different...
are these people on Mass Health? Is that
No, this is for everybody. This is universal.
Okay.
This is everybody.
All right.
These are, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th generation drugs. There is no research and development that's left in doing it, so you don't need to pay that. So we're requiring for everybody, for every consumer, capping those prices.
Okay.
That's what's in the PACT Act. And then the other kind of bill that's floating out there is a hospital regulatory bill, looking at our for-profit hospitals in Massachusetts. Luckily, we don't have a Stewart-provided healthcare facility here in Western Mass, but they closed in the Boston area, providing gaps in healthcare. And so looking at these for-profit providers, holding them accountable so they can't just pick up shop and leave an area desolate from any type of healthcare access. There are two pending bills on the House and the Senate side that are very important. So those three areas, I think, hopefully we can get some resolution before the end of session.
I'm just curious. I just want to go back to this PACT Act. You said the Senate has passed this 4 times. So has the difficulty been in the House?
Well, that
has it
House
been...
had actually taken it up this session, which is wonderful, and that has been, really something that is favorable. So now we're negotiating the differences between both versions of it. But there are important things within those bills because there's so many people that rely on prescription drugs. I mean, if you have, heart disease, which runs in my family, if you have diabetes, which is, a significant issue for a lot of people that people are facing, they're relying on these drugs. And so capping these prices, I think, is something that could see a huge benefit, not just for seniors, but anybody who relies on them.
Okay, so as a senior and as a diabetic, I want to tell you, who uses insulin, the fact that the Biden administration did what they did about capping insulin prices has made a very significant impact basically on your budget. I'll just tell you, when I would go to pick up my insulin, the price would vary before this. It was almost like buying gasoline, you know? It was like you were never quite sure what the price was going to be. So between the federal action and what you're talking about on the state level, this would provide economic relief to a variety of people who've got chronic illnesses, obviously. That's really significant. So do you think that that will get some resolution between the House and the Senate?
It's my hope. You know, it passed overwhelmingly on the Senate side and the House side. The economic development bill needs a vote of both chambers in a formal session. The PACT Act doesn't, because we're not bonding funding, so it could be something that we could pass in informal session, just like we've passed in the last several weeks since the closeout in late July, major pieces of legislation that attracted support on Beacon Hill, everything from long-term care access bill that we passed 2 weeks ago, which is the first regulatory change in about 25 years, focusing in on our nursing homes and our assisted living facilities and providing the proper oversight that's necessary there. So we can still get things over the finish line, even if we don't go back into formal session, but we have to do that for the economic development bill.
So this morning I was on NEPM's The Rundown. One of the topics that was discussed was a story about the climate change. I want to get the title correct. It was climate supervisor? No, that can't be it. Governor Healy has created this new position of someone in her administration who's going to be focusing on climate change. And this individual was out here in the western part of the state taking a look at various agricultural operations that are trying to deal with climate change. Of course, last year we had the tremendous rain in the summer that wiped out whole fields of crops for western Massachusetts farmers. I know a good part of your district is rural, and I'm wondering if you're hearing anybody talk about the impact that climate change is making on our agriculture, which is a key part of western Massachusetts economy. Are you hearing stuff this year about that?
Yes, and our climate czar here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, she's not just, visiting Western Mass, she lives right on the edge of Western Mass and Central Massachusetts. So she's out here often. I had dinner with her back in the springtime at the University of Massachusetts during a dinner series we had for women in leadership and government. And I'm impressed by the level of focus that she is focusing in on Western Massachusetts farmers. The floods that happened last year in the Pioneer Valley that took out our berry crops through the late frost, the flooding that took out a lot of our other crops in the valley. The Senate put in and the House agreed to $25 million of relief to our farmers in Western Massachusetts, led by the Western Mass legislative delegation, and we were happy to do that. But it's not sustainable. Right. We can't throw in $25 million every year towards relief for farmers. We need to be sustainable and find ways in which we can help out our farmers, allow them to be prosperous, allow them to do their job to grow here in the valley, but also at the same time fighting and pushing back against climate change. When you look at Springfield, when it was deemed for over a decade as the asthma capital of the United States because of the levels of carcinogens in our air right now, we need to do everything to fight this threat. And so we've worked hard in the legislature over the past couple of sessions on our climate roadmap to look at the long-term use of our reliance on fossil fuels, but also ways in which we can green our economy, help out our farmers at the same time, and also ensure that we have access to what this area was founded for, and that was agriculture. I have many working farms in my district, many of whom benefited from that $25 million last year. This year was a really good year for farmers, but we know other years might not be, and it depends on what you're growing, really depends on that type of thing. But I'm so pleased that Governor Healy's climate czar is focused on Western Massachusetts and sustainability here, because we do have a lot of working farms. We do have so many people that rely on it. I rely on it. I get most of my fruits and vegetables from local farms right here in the Pioneer Valley. Looking forward to going apple picking this weekend at one of the farms in my district. And we need to ensure that they have the tools necessary in order to become climate resilient. The research that the University of Massachusetts is doing, including through Cold Springs Orchard, which is located in my district in Belchertown. I brought about 20 members of the Senate out here to Western Mass this past spring to take a tour, and they are working on climate resiliency technology there in order for us to maximize our crops and help out local farmers. And that economic development bill, not to harp on it too much, includes $30 million to focus in on that food science, which could go to help out farmers in the Pioneer Valley.
I think what a lot of people may be under the misconception that agriculture has diminished in our area. And everything that I've read is that actually we have more agriculture. We have additional agricultural coming back into Western Massachusetts. So that provides jobs, that puts money into the economy. But in this particular case, obviously climate change, it's a heightened threat to that burgeoning agricultural economy that we've got.
And it's not just agriculture itself, it's also agro-tourism. Agro-tourism is one of the greatest growing sectors here in Massachusetts. I just talked about apple picking. People go apple picking. People go to orchards. People pick blueberries. They pick strawberries. They pick different types of fruits, and they're going to Western Massachusetts as a destination where they can access these family-run farms. So if you go out to the western part of the United States, they mostly have agro businesses, large corporations that run farms. Here in New England, we still have small family-run farms that rely on maybe 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 employees to harvest each and every year, but they are family-run and they're small. And so that's the uniqueness of the Pioneer Valley. I was happy to actually sponsor a budget amendment to the FY25 budget that was successful for $100,000 for our senior farm share program, which allows senior citizens at their senior centers to apply and get access to fresh fruits and vegetables right here from the Pioneer Valley. So they can get for $10 over $100 worth of produce by this investment from the state that we partner with our farmers with and with our councils on aging to ensure that seniors have access to fruits and vegetables that are grown right here in the valley. Well,
one thing that you and I touched on when we talked at Sheriff Cochey's picnic this year is housing. And I'd like to revisit that. Just this week, we had the dedication for a new group of condos in the south end of Springfield. I believe it was 40 units. These are designed for first-time home buyers who meet naturally the standards that they have for application. There's going to be a lottery. Clearly, it's a win for the city. Certainly in my neighborhood, in my street, I've got 2 duplexes that are going up. Are you seeing that we're having some forward movement in terms of the housing crisis?
And that's popping up all over the city. So we just went to a ribbon cutting over in Mason Square for the Knox building, which is putting in over 150 units of some affordable and market rate housing that are absolutely beautiful, utilizing where they built the Knox cars right across from the Indian Motorcycle Company. In my hometown of Ludlow, 2/10 of a mile from where I live, the Ludlow Mills complex, the Clock Tower building, is going to be opening over 100 units of new affordable and mixed-use housing as well for our area and retail space. So these investments in aging mill buildings aren't done just by private developers. It takes a lot of work by the state and the federal government and our local communities to invest in them, to provide the credits to remediate these buildings and sites. And what the housing bill that we passed this session, a $5.1 billion investment in our housing stock in Massachusetts, really focuses on revamping and breathing new life in many of these vacant buildings, factory buildings that dot the Pioneer Valley, whether you're here in Springfield or in Chicopee or in Ludlow or in one of my small towns of Warren, Massachusetts. There is enormous potential to convert spaces into housing because we need more housing stock, we need more types of housing, and a few other areas within that bill that are pretty important. Something that I worked on over the last two sessions was including ADUs, accessory dwelling units, to be allowed to be put into to communities here in Western Mass, and that was included in the final version of the housing bond bill that we passed. I also want to make sure that our consumers are protected when they buy a home. Obviously, crumbling foundations continues to be something that impacts many communities in Western Mass and Central Massachusetts and in Connecticut, and ensuring that we have proper oversight and consumer protection policies that help out homeowners so they can get their foundations fixed and remediated, but also understanding when you're buying a home. There was an amendment that I had filed to the housing bill, and it was led on the House side by State Representative Orlando Ramos, right here from Springfield, was to require that you can't require an inspection to be waived in order to put in a bid for a house. Up until this bill was passed, there were people that were buying homes that were forced into waiving their inspections on the home in order to even put a bid. We outlawed that in this bill, so there were serious consumer protection issues as well. But we also open up enormous capital for developers to come in and revitalize spaces that have been vacant for a long time, to build housing there, and giving those credits that are needed to our local communities so they can invest more in affordable and market rate housing. It's not a one-stop approach where you're looking just at buildings or single family homes. This bill looks at a multitude of areas to invest in housing, because that's what's needed in order to solve our housing crisis here in the Commonwealth.
Okay, we're going to go to the lightning round.
Okay.
All right. We have an election coming up with several ballot questions. I'm just wondering what your stance and your opinion are on these ballot questions. And I'm going to go out of order. Unionization of transportation network drivers, which basically means the Uber and Lyft people, whether or not they can form a union. Mm-hmm. Do you think that is a valid issue? I'm
going to be voting yes on that question this cycle. Looking at the kind of abuses that a lot of our gig worker economies have when you're going and trying to make a few extra dollars, there are not a lot of protections for Uber and Lyft drivers right now. And what this ballot question would do is provide some of those protections, allow them to unionize, allow them to actually bargain collectively so they can have more control over it. I know a lot of people go into it because they have flexibility, but they also have a lot of constraints. And I think what the ballot question is intended to do is to provide those workers with the ability in order to get a little bit more say in their working coverage and their hours and their wages. And I think that's important.
The elimination of MCAS. This is obviously a huge, huge issue. I know that you used to be on the school committee in Ludlow, so MCAS is something that you frequently heard about. What do you think about that one?
Well, personally, I was the second graduating class that required MCAS as a graduation requirement. It was implemented in 2003 for that graduating class. I graduated in 2004, and I can remember the anxiety I felt just as an individual taking a standardized test and understanding that whether or not I was going to walk across the stage at graduation, there was an enormous amount of pressure. As a school committee member for 12 years, I fought very hard at the national level to reverse No Child Left Behind and implement the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was passed in 2015, that lifted the federal requirement for high-stakes testing. And in fact, since the passage of that act, nearly every state, except for a handful, has removed a high-stakes graduation exam requirement like MCAS from the books. It's about time Massachusetts does so as well. I'm the son of an educator. My dad's a high school math teacher. We shouldn't be teaching to the test. We should be teaching towards the standards that are there instead of a single high-stakes test. And what it shows in high-stakes testing is not the competency of the quality of education that you're receiving from a school district, but what it shows a lot of times is the level of poverty of a school district, and doesn't really inform decisions that teachers are making or schools are making. What it does is it puts up a barrier for particularly students of color in low-income communities from graduating high schools. I want to move to a different standard. In fact, next Saturday, I'll be hosting a Canvas kickoff in Wilbraham to knock on doors with members of the Mass Teachers Association to talk about the need to remove MCAS as a graduation requirement. But it's important to point out, We're not against testing. We're not against accountability. What we're against is a high-stakes test that really adds no value and shows nothing to a school district except the level of poverty and the level of need of a school district. And so I want to eliminate that. I'm hoping the voters will agree on question 2.
Okay, let's talk about shrooms. One of the ballot questions is limited legislation and regulation of certain natural psychedelic substances. Now, I know that other states have decriminalized psychedelic mushrooms. They've allowed for the sale of it under, of course, regulated conditions. Do we need this in Massachusetts?
I haven't made a decision on this yet. I'm still actually researching the pros and cons of this. I've heard from both sides on this issue. I think there are benefits to a lot of people from allowing the ability for certain psychedelic drugs in order to help them, whether it's with sleep, anxiety, other issues. So, you know, you don't want to close that down, the opportunity for folks, but you also don't want to create another situation where you could be, you know, delving into a controlled substance that could get out of hand. So, you know, I'm going to read the ballot question. I think there's work that we can do in the legislature to possibly legalize some of these substances on our own without the ballot process, but it should give us an indication of where the public is on this particular issue. Right. But I haven't made a decision yet on it.
Okay, and last, but certainly not least, for a state senator, about the ballot question about allowing the state auditor to audit the legislature.
First off, the legislature, both the House and the Senate, are financially audited by a third-party provider each and every year, and it's posted on our website. The audit that we're talking about in question 1, I think, is utterly unconstitutional, and I'm confident that the courts will throw it out because it is basically going against our 250-year history of not allowing one individual or an individual who is not a legislator to dictate how a legislative body, the #1 branch in government, on how to operate. The auditor has the ability to financially audit state agencies. The legislature is not a state agency. We are the people's branch. We are elected every 2 years. We are responsive to our constituents. Certainly there are areas which I would like to improve the efficiency of the legislature, but an unconstitutional audit, throwing in, you know, power into the lowest level of our constitutional office, an office that people don't really know much about, I think is misguided. In fact, the former state auditor, Suzanne Bump, testified against this measure at the State House because it's well out of the scope and the authority of the auditor's office. I think our auditor right now is playing politics with this question, using it to raise her own personal profile rather than actually trying to help and audit state agencies, which is in the jurisdiction of the state auditor's office. And I do have to say with that, follow the money who's behind this act. There are a lot of shady organizations, far right-wing organizations, including the Mass Fiscal Alliance and other groups that are behind this ballot measure. So when I hear progressives talk to me about the need to audit the legislature, I tell them follow the money. Look at the significant amount of resources that these very conservative groups are trying to invest in this ballot question, because a few years from now, they could take over the auditor's office and weaponize a constitutional office against the people's branch. That can't happen. There's a local professor, Gerald Duquette from Long Meadow, who teaches in Connecticut, who has written extensively about this and the need to reform the legislature. This is not the way to do it.
Senator, as always, a pleasure speaking with you. And definitely, I'm sure, like me, you're looking forward to November to see how everything shakes out, both on our state level and, of course, on the federal level. Yeah. And maybe we'll have you come back and we can do an analysis session.
I would love to do an election recap after.
Okay.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. And, folks, thank you very much for watching Focus Springfield and this edition of Government Matters.